Good evening, everybody, and welcome to P1 Governance, Risk and Ethics. And this is class number 4. So we're moving towards the halfway point. It might not necessarily feel like that because the class notes, it's a bit of a slow push through the corporate governance stuff at the beginning. And only then in the second half of the course do we move on and look at everything else. But we are making reasonable progress. We start tonight at chapter number 4. And I suppose I should answer the first question that's arrived and say yes, the P1 class has indeed started, because here I am. So the fact that you're typing that makes me slightly nervous that there is a little problem. And I'm sort of hoping it's at your end, not ours. If anyone else would like to just say, hello, yes, they can hear me, that would be very helpful at this point. Oh, wonderful. Good stuff. Okay then, so let me remind you what we have been doing so far. We have looked at what corporate governance is. We have looked at the reasons why we need it, i.e. corporate disasters have shown us that if you don't control what executive directors do, they have a nasty habit of either acting incompetently or of running the company in their own best interests, not that of the shareholders. We have also questioned whether it's just about shareholders and maybe directors should be running companies with some consideration for other stakeholder groups as well. We then opened up the UK Code of Corporate Governance and looked at the main areas that it covers. And we've gone through the whole code sort of in overview. What we've then started to do is look at the individual parts of corporate governance in a bit more detail. And we find ourselves now at chapter number 4, which means we're going to be looking at some board committees. Not all of them at this stage, just 2 of the 3 that are required by the Code of Corporate Governance. And then we will be moving on beyond that to look at directors' interaction with shareholders, bit of corporate governance variety around the world, and things like that. So we'll be pushing towards the end of the corporate governance this evening. But before we get into the class notes and continue, as I have done on many occasions during the course and I will continue to do throughout, we're going to start with a little look at some news stories from this week that you should be interested in because of P1. But even before we do that, I also need to say to you that because this is the halfway point after tonight, tomorrow at 5:15, I think it is, we have our first mentoring session at the halfway point. Half an hour where I will be reviewing what we've covered so far. I will also take a little look at an exam question that's based on what we've done so far. So we could take a look at how things can come up. So that's all coming tomorrow. But as I said, before we go any further with the notes tonight, I'll disappear down into this little corner and take a look at some interesting stories that I've seen. And I think all of these actually are within the last 48 hours. So these are hot off the presses. We start with legal and general. So just to put them in the context of the course, legal and general, big institutional investor. And they have announced within the last couple of days that any company who they believe are not adequately addressing climate change risks to their profits. So any company not adequately addressing climate change risks to their profits Legal and General are going to let that company know about it by voting against the chairman's re-election at the next AGM they attend. So why is this interesting? Well, what we've got is an example of an active institutional investor. And the reason they are active and intervening is because they are not happy with the risk management at the company. Now, you might be tempted to look at this and think, climate change. They are being ethical. They want to save the planet. That's not the reason they're doing this. And they're very open about why they're doing this. This is not them being environmentally friendly because it's the right thing to do. The reason they're doing this is that as an investor, they are worried that the value of their investments in some companies is going to plummet. Because if those companies are heavily exposed to anything which is helping to create climate change, and I appreciate that the American president thinks that climate change is all a joke and is reversing environmentally friendly laws in America and opening up the American coal industry again. And coal equals carbon, and carbon equals climate change, by the way. But this institutional investor is saying, look, governments around the world, maybe not America, but governments around the world are going to have to legislate sometime soon, because if temperatures keep rising at the way they are currently rising, it is unsustainable. We have got to do something about this. And since governments are surely going to do something about this, any company which relies on things like coal for its profits are going to get a very nasty shock at some point. And Legal and General are saying, look, it's very simple. Do something about this, directors, because otherwise our investment in you is going to go down. And if you don't do anything, at some point we'll just sell all of our shares. So a very strong message being put out here. But note, it is a purely financial argument. So this is an investor being a capitalist. If you don't sort this out, governments will legislate, and at that point the value of your company will go down, therefore the value of our investment in it will go down. Sort it out. Now, this is part of a growing theme of a number of investment companies, insurance companies, pension schemes, who are quite openly saying to companies, do something about your exposure to climate change. They're not saying get out because it will save the world. I suppose they're quite happy for other companies they've not invested in to be mining coal, for example. But if they've got money tied up in you, they want you out of things that are causing climate change. Now, a great example of how this can play out is in Germany. Because after the nuclear disaster in Japan a few years back, the German government decided that it was simply too dangerous to do nuclear energy, and so they've made it illegal. They've basically banned it. So suddenly there are companies who are going to be forced to spend a huge amount of money to shut down their nuclear facilities, and those companies have been told they'll have to pay for it. So it's not just a reduction in revenues, potentially enormous costs as well. And a very sudden decision. So when governments legislate on very high, big issue areas like nuclear or climate change or something like that, it can have massive and very sudden impacts on the values of companies. And investors are scared, purely for their money. So there's an interesting one I thought I would share with you. Second one, also an element of social responsibility going on here. The UK government has announced that it is looking into the level of personal debt that people have. It is extremely concerned that some people have got such massive debts, there's no hope of them ever paying them off. And the UK government has suggested that credit card companies should forgive those in the most debt the interest charges that they've racked up over the years, i.e. cancel them, to give people a chance of paying off at least some of what they owe. Now that's an interesting debate, isn't it? Because some would say, well, if you've borrowed the money and incurred the charges, it's your responsibility to pay it. No one forced you to. But basically what the government seems to be saying here is that credit card companies should accept that they have a social responsibility in that they've made profits from customers making big debts and having helped create the problem, they should do something about helping to get those debts cleared. Interesting arguments. Now, at the moment, the government is only saying this should happen in the more extreme cases where someone is basically bankrupt if they're not given some help. But it's interesting that the government's not saying it will help contribute. There's no government aid going on here. It's saying the private sector has profited from this and the private sector has a responsibility. Does it have a responsibility? Interesting debating points that we will be looking at during the second half of the course. A third one for you. The BBC, the venerable BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation. Now the BBC is basically a public sector operation, but it's got an element of independence, because there is a danger that if the main television station in your country is owned and operated by the government, then it will only say what the government wants it to say. And the BBC is very proud that it tries, sometimes with some criticism, it tries to report the news in a balanced way and tries to avoid political interference. It's part funded by the government, part funded by people in the UK who have to pay a licence fee to be able to have a television service. And the BBC is changing from a two-tier board to a new unitary board. Not the sort of change you see happen very often. So what used to happen is the Director General, who's basically the CEO of the BBC, used to run the management and then report up to a board of trustees. Now there'll be one board and a chairman has been appointed, and the Director General will have to be held accountable and report to the chairman, and then the chairman will be accountable to, what are they called? Not sure the BBC Trust is going to carry on, but basically up to the government. So, a change in strategy for the BBC, trying to make things look a bit more accountable by having one board instead of having two. Very interesting story. There's lots of angles to it. I've barely had a chance to read it yet. This is one, though, since it's the BBC and we've all heard of it. I think you might want to go and have a look at this. So this new board, who decides who's on it? Well, I think the BBC get to pick some people, but the government also get to pick some people. We will be looking at public sector versus private sector very shortly on the course. Maybe we'll get onto that tonight, maybe we won't, we'll see. And this is a very interesting hybrid type organisation. It's public sector, but the government tries to sort of keep out of running it as much as it can, which gives it an element of private sector feel to it. So interesting story, I think. Anyway, enough of the stories for now. We finished chapter 3 of the class notes last week. So class number 4 gets the start with chapter number 4. Isn't that beautifully symmetrical? This chapter is going to look at 2 of the board committees that we have on our course. Just a reminder for you that the Corporate Governance Code requires an audit committee, a nomination committee, and a remuneration committee. And it is these 2 that we'll be looking at in chapter 4. Audit committees come up later in the course when we look at internal controls, internal audit. And there are other committees that companies could have that do get an airing on the course. Those being risk committees and also possibly ethics committees. But they are not requirements of the code. They are optional extras that quite a few companies choose to have. Before we look at the 2 committees and what they actually do, our starting point is to ask ourselves a question. Why have committees at all? Why not just do everything at the main board meetings? Well, one reason for having the committees is to stop the main board meetings being too long. Cover certain items in separate committees, it helps to make the main board meeting a little more focused. A second reason for having separate committees is not everyone on the main board can contribute to some issues, and it therefore makes more sense to get those people who can contribute into a separate room so that those people who just be sitting there twiddling their fingers and not really helping can be somewhere else. Another reason for corporate governance requiring these committees is it sends a signal that remuneration, can't even say it, remuneration, nomination, audit, and also if we were having risk and ethics committees, are important areas. And having separate committees will also even ensure these areas get the time and focus that are required. But I suspect the main primary reason why we need separate committees is we don't want the executives in the discussion. Because if the Remuneration Committee is looking at directors' pay, primarily the executives, we don't want the executives in the room while their pay is being discussed, do we? So a lot of this is all to do with one of the favourite words on this course. It is about making sure that those committees can work independently. So with the corporate governance part of the course, the knowledge itself is not that difficult. Try to make sure that you've thought about why corporate governance wants things done in a certain way. Don't just memorise what the governance issues are. Make sure you can explain the logic behind them. Okay, let's get into the chapter. Some of the chapters at this point, by the way, get very short because we're dealing with very specific parts of governance only, which is good news because it helps us move on a bit. The notes tell us that nomination committees, the first one we'll look at, are one of 4 subordinate governance structures. But just to repeat what I said before, there are 4 committees on the syllabus, but only the first 3 of these, so the top 3 above my head there, are actually required by the UK Code. The role of committees is largely what I've just been saying. By having specialists in separate committees, you can use their expertise. They will then come back and advise the main board on what the company should be doing in those areas. But let's move down and look at the nomination committee. What does a nomination committee actually do? Well, they are there to nominate those people who should be joining a board and those people perhaps who should be leaving the board. So it's all about the people who are the directors of this company. In doing that, they need to look at things like, now I'm going to change what the notes say here slightly, because this suggests a 50-50 executives versus non-executive split. You don't want a 50-50 split. You want the independent non-executives to be at least 50% of the board. If they're 90% of the board, that's fine as well. So just to be clear, the need to ensure that at least 50% of the board are independent non-executives. They will keep an eye on independence issues such as cross-directorships, but also other independence issues as well. Re-election requirements, making sure that directors are up for re-election on a regular basis at the AGM. The need to renew and refresh the board. You don't want all the directors sitting there for 38 years and never changing. You need new ideas, new energy to be coming onto the board. Skill base, adapt to changing challenges. Succession, move on to that one in a minute. I suppose in the modern day we should also say that they need to make sure an adequate level of diversity is achieved on the board. What do we mean by succession planning? Well, the people on the board are fulfilling the top level jobs at the company. They are not necessarily easy people to find or replace. As such, you need to look at people like your chief executive, your chairman, And make sure you've got a rough idea of when they are likely to be leaving your company, because they're not going to stick around forever. And you need to start working on finding who will take over from them when those people leave. That could be an internal candidate who's already on the board. But of course, they might leave themselves before the role opens up. So if you've got someone who you think could be the next chief executive, you might want to start letting them know that you've got promotion ideas for them in the future, in the hope that means they don't leave. If it's people outside the company you've got your eye on, you might want to start having a conversation with them and saying, look, at some point in the future, we'd love you to come and work with us. So that is succession planning. It's not something purely for directors. Any employer is looking at the people in the roles at present and trying to ask themselves, when might that person leave, or when might that person be promoted and create a gap? With some lower paid jobs, you can find replacement staff fairly quickly. With directors, when you find the right person, they might be on 6 months' notice somewhere else. So it's going to be a while since they can, before they can come and join you. When a nomination committee needs to find a new director, they need to have a process. Now you'll notice here up on the screen, it starts to mention succession again, diversity comes up. And then once you know the sort of person you need and when you need them, you create a personal profile, a sort of CV without a name on it. You then head off and typically use external employment consultants, tell them the sort of person you're looking for, and get them to go through their contacts and see what they can find for you. That creates some independence to the process and stops the existing directors simply recruiting their mates, which has always been a bit of a problem in the past. Let's now move on and look at second committee. Remuneration. Remuneration, as I've mentioned and you've probably noticed, is probably the most controversial area of the business world. The reason is pretty straightforward. My pay is decided by my boss, but my boss is the boss. So who decides my boss's pay? And the answer is, he decides his own. But then he owns the company, so he can sort of choose to do that, I suppose. In listed companies, there are shareholders, and it's their money that is paying the directors. So a bit of a thorny issue when it comes to directors' pay and how we're going to sort this out. I reckon that if that question came up on exam day, your initial thought would be, ooh, this is an easy question. But you know what? It's not. It's easy for the first point, because if they're a remuneration committee, I'm guessing they do remuneration. But if this is worth 4 marks, then you would have to think further as to what this committee is going to do. Indeed, they are going to design pay packages for each director. That is true. But you will notice I have put that as my second bullet point, which means there's going to be a first one. If I am the chair of a remuneration committee, before I look at the first director on the board and work out how we might go about paying them, I need to have a process for doing this. For example, I need to decide, as a company, are we planning to pay industry average, or are we looking to pay above industry average and therefore hopefully attract a better quality of person? So I need a plan for salary. I need to think about what benefits company directors are going to get. I need to think about bonus schemes. Will I have one bonus scheme to cover all the directors, or individual bonus schemes that depend on their individual roles? I need plans and strategies. Once I have decided what sort of schemes we are going to have, then I need to design pay packages for each director. Part of that is going to be checking that we are not breaching any laws regarding the payment of directors. I'm not talking minimum wage here. I'd imagine they're probably on more than that. But there are some laws in some industries, in particular like banking, where there are limits on things like bonuses that you can pay. And it's not just legal. You might also, as a committee, want to consider whether the pay you are proposing appears to be ethically appropriate. Should businesses care about ethics? Interesting debate coming up in the second half of the course. But given the outcry that directors' pay causes and the very big amounts people are getting paid, some look at the morals of all of this are surely worthwhile. Having done all of this, you should ensure that remuneration disclosures in the annual report and financial statements are accurate and complete. And when it comes to those bonuses, you've set up the scheme, but at the end of each year, you'll have to decide whether each director has qualified for their bonuses. So you see, what a remuneration committee does is not just a single sentence. There are several aspects to it. And with things like this list, which are quite hard to learn because they're not very technically difficult, so there's no reason for them to stick in your head. I find the best way of learning these little lists is practice, to be honest. Do what I do. Pretend you're teaching the course. See what you can come up with. It's all in your head somewhere. You've just got to practice drawing it out. Principles of remuneration. I like to call this ARM. You are arming your directors. You need pay that will attract good quality people to the board, will keep them from leaving, retain them, and will motivate them. Motivate them to do what? Well, hopefully motivate them to act in the best interests of the shareholders and any other stakeholders, if you so believe. The notes will then take us through the various aspects of pay. The fact that we would like it to be motivating and performance related that you saw on the previous page, we'll go through that in a minute. And then looking at process. So performance related pay is the primary way where we can try to motivate, as we've just seen, the directors to act in the best interests of shareholders, as it says just there. As I said though, you might also want to throw in some criteria based on other stakeholders as well. You'll notice it says corporate, individual, financial and non-financial criteria. So for example, at BP, they had a big accident about 6 years ago. So part of the bonus structure there is on improvements in health and safety, because that's clearly something, clearly something they need to get better at. When you're setting targets, you've got to work out where you get these targets from. Are they good targets? Are they too easy? Are they too hard? So typically you'll benchmark these targets against other companies in the industry, possibly regulatory targets between each director to try to make sure you get the right balance. And as noted earlier, the Remuneration Committee needs to have a process. The Remuneration Committee should be non-executives only. You need to make sure no one sets their own pay. So if the chairman of the board is on the Remuneration Committee, then the Remuneration Committee should not set the chairman's pay, because the chairman would be in the room. Non-executive pay, by the way, I've mentioned it already with independence of NEDs earlier in the course. Non-executive pay is typically set at a market rate, sometimes set by the whole board, sometimes run past the shareholders, etc. This last sentence is not quite as simple as it first looks. You could argue that the directors' bosses are the shareholders, so why not have the directors propose their pay and then get the shareholders to authorise it? That could make sense. But that is not actually the way that pay works in most countries, and it's not the way it works in the UK. In the UK, the vote on pay is not a binding vote. It is purely advisory to allow the shareholders to tell the board whether they're happy with pay or not. The board does not need to change their plans at all, most of the time. Every few years, a binding vote is likely to happen, but the annual vote on pay is not a binding vote at all. Although there's a lot of debate that that should be changed, and it seems sensible. I mean, surely it's the shareholders' money being spent. The easiest way to manage directors' pay is to say to the shareholders each year, this is what we're planning for the next 12 months, say yes or no. Now, as I've said already, there is a very big push at the moment by a lot of institutional investors, at the very least, to challenge directors' pay and executive pay in particular. It's been felt for years that it has been going up and up and up for no good reason, and a lot of the big institutional investors have already announced that in the AGMs that have started happening over the last couple of weeks or so, their intention is to vote against executive pay unless there is clear evidence that the directors are earning it. They are going to be very active in this regard. The other point at the top just talks about the disclosure in the annual report. Let's now move on to the rather more important components. Now, the class notes have 4 components, it seems. But with 2 of these, we're actually going to break them up. The notes do cover everything, but I'm going to break it up into 6 points. And we'll do it on here. Just a reminder, this is executive pay, not non-executive. Typically, pension contribution is a percentage of salary, and if the salary is the fixed element, that would mean that the pension contribution is fixed as well. The result is that for these two, it is typically not performance related, and is therefore likely to be set by market conditions and the experience and skills of the director that we are looking at. We then have benefits, so things like company car, private health cover, and things like that. Benefits are often also set by market expectations. I'd imagine most directors would expect to get a company car as part of their deal, for example. However, you could potentially make them performance related. Basically, performance related is anything that motivates the directors to do what you want them to do. And it may well be that a director is less motivated by money and more motivated by being able to get membership of an exclusive golf club, for example. And if your company can get access to that and the director can't, that could be a way of motivating them. So it's up to you. Now, those three are interesting to an extent, but it's the other bits that are more important for your exam. Bonuses have now been split on the course into two types. The more obvious one is a performance-related bonus, but what about loyalty bonuses? Well, we want a bit of consistency in the strategy of the company and therefore the people coming up with that strategy. So whilst we want to refresh the board from time to time, we also want to try and keep good people. So a loyalty bonus is simply that. If you are still there on a given date, you get a reward for not having left. But don't forget, there's many ways of leaving the board. And this could be rewarding them for not having chosen to go. It might be rewarding them for not being voted off by the shareholders, which I suppose would imply they are performing well. There is some debate about the value of loyalty bonuses. Getting a bonus for still being there does not seem like a remarkable achievement. I mean, I'm still at my company and no one's giving me a bonus for still being here. The more critical one for the course is the performance bonus. If you are trying to align your directors' performance with what shareholders want, it's likely to be based on things like profit, return on capital employed, earnings per share, sales growth maybe, market share, but it doesn't have to be those things. You could also do it based on something like health and safety record, which would presumably interest employees. Customer feedback. Obviously customers. The amount of fines and penalties that have been paid. So there, the stakeholder you're looking at is regulatory stuff. You could do it based on pollution levels. Which obviously is looking at the environmental stakeholder. The fact is, you can choose whatever you like. The more measures you put in there, the more complicated the bonus scheme gets, but the harder it is to cheat it, and the more stakeholders you can bring into the calculation. So there's a bit of a trade-off between complexity and addressing as many stakeholder needs as you see fit. Bonuses have got a habit of being a bit short-termist. In other words, you get it based on last year's numbers. Which means we probably want to have some sort of performance thing which is longer term. But before we get on to that, there is another issue with bonuses, which is the risk you pay the director a bonus and then in the future discover it was earned illegally or unethically. Which leaves you thinking, I wish we hadn't paid them that bonus because I think we've got grounds to get it back. Well, what a lot of companies are now doing is they are putting a clawback provision in the bonus deal, which may mean, yes, we'll pay you your money, but if at any point in the next 3 years, 5 years, we discover you've been naughty, we have the legal right to make you repay it to us. Or you defer the bonus, and yet you've earned it, but you're not getting the cash for another 3 years. Or you pay the bonus in shares, which they're not allowed to sell for the next 3 years. So it is possible to make bonuses a bit more long-term if you want to. And then the final element of director's pay is going to be shares or share options. So this might be share options that exercise in 3 to 5 years, or shares that you cannot sell for 3 to 5 years. And if we want good governance to mean longer term company performance, then these long-term investment plans, often called LTIPs, are going to help in that regard. They do have one little downside I've noticed, which is you may do something this year which means you qualify for this long-term award. You've done really well. Well done you. The problem is you get paid or awarded in 5 years' time when maybe the company's not doing well and you seem to be getting a lot of reward at that point. The difficulty being no one remembers that you're getting the reward this year for something you did several years ago. So it seems perfectly fair, in fact. And that is director's pay. And that brings us to the end of chapter 4. A relatively quick one, isn't that nice? Which means we can move on to chapter number 5 and shareholder relationships. What I think would make a lot of sense at that point, given we're roughly halfway through tonight's class and we've reached the end of a chapter, is for us to have a little 5-minute break at that point to refresh. So my friends, I will see you in 5 minutes' time. Won't be long.